This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Greg Weiner his new book, Madison's Metronome, The Constitution, Majority Rule, and the Tempo of American Politics. Professor Weiner is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Assumption College. But before that, he served as Press Secretary to U.S. Senator Bob Kerrey. He was also the founder and president of the Washington, D.C.-based Content Communications, where he wrote speeches and op-eds for national political figures, some of which appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. He has also ghostwritten books as well. Professor Weiner before that taught at Brown University, where he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Political Theory Project. Professor Weiner, welcome to Liberty Law Talk.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Professor, let me ask you from the beginning. You've written a book about James Madison's political thought, specifically his commitment to republicanism and majority rule within the American constitutional system. But let me ask you, there are volumes and volumes of Madisonian scholarship. You reference a lot of this in your book and what's been helpful and has taught you. But what sets your book apart? What are you trying to prove in this book?
I think what I'm trying to suggest is that his commitment to majority rule is more extensive than the previous scholarship, which, as you noted, there's quite a lot of suggests that there has been a long-running debate in Madison scholarship as to whether he's more concerned about majority rule or individual rights. And what the book attempts to do is to square that circle by saying the commitment to majority rule comes first, but that he's able to season it by using the mechanism of time.
Let me ask you, why does James Madison have, or why should we understand him as having almost a metaphysical commitment to majority rule? Is he not better known and understood as a guarantor of liberalism, and specifically of individual autonomy regarding property rights, freedom of speech, religious belief? As between liberalism and majority rule, why would majority rule be his commitment, and why would that be better in his eyes to defend?
Sure. I think we need to make a conceptual distinction here between majority rule and liberalism, in the sense that majority rule is a mechanism for making decisions. Liberalism is a criteria for evaluating decisions. So if we think of this in Aristotelian terms, you can have decisions made by the one, the few, or the many. If it's not the many, it's got to be either the one or the few. And the question from Madison's point of view is, why should we expect decisions from the one or the few to be any more liberal than decisions made by the many? I mean, there comes a point in any political community where somebody's got to pull the trigger and somebody's got to make a decision. And the question is always going to be, again, is that going to be the one or the few or the many? Right? For Madison, it's always the many. There's simply no better alternative. But by using the mechanism of delay, he's able to achieve this value of liberalism at the same time. Or at least I describe this in the book as quantum constitutionalism. He's able to at least project certain probabilities that grow with time that liberal values are going to be guaranteed. But I think a certain confusion arises if we say we've got to choose between majority rule and liberalism, or if we plot those two against each other as though they're points on the same axis, when in fact they deal with different issues politically. So
something you reflect upon in your book is this aspect, and you just said it, delay or time, allowing passions to cool, allowing reason hopefully to intervene and guide the majority, because as you rightly note, the majority will get its way. In some form or another. The question really becomes, what does that form look like? Is it the form when the passion starts, when the ideas and the push starts, or is it something else? I want to reflect on, and you note this quotation. This is Publius, or what is James Madison, in Federalist 55. And this is on reflections upon the House, and the House being reliant upon the people, but also the dangers that might result. So I'm going to read this, and I want to ask you a couple of questions. So here's James Madison, quote, "The truth is that in all cases, a certain number at least seems to be necessary to secure the benefits of free consultation and discussion, and to guard against too easy a combination for improper purposes. as on the other hand, the number ought at most to be kept within a certain limit, in order to avoid the confusion and intemperance of a multitude. In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever characters composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. So let me ask you, what is reason, what is will, and what is passion in Madison's political thought?
It's a good question, and it's a very important passage in which he's reflecting on the proper size of the house. And as in most things in Madison's thought, he wants to come down somewhere close to a mean. I think reason, with no pun intended for Madison, is very much bound up with reason giving, with the ability to articulate in a political context reasons for one's position, and specifically reasons that are able to take account of other people's interests. Tocqueville calls this self-interest well understood or rightly understood. The idea that when we reflect carefully, we understand we are able to see that our interests are bound up with other people's interests, and that if we respect other people's rights, they'll respect our rights in turn. So I think that's essentially what reason means for Madison: the ability to give reasons and to take account of other people's interests and points of view. Passion and will, I think, we see the Scottish psychology very much at work here. I think are bound up in one another. Passion is the sort of impulsive, reflexive seizing upon one's own interests without being able to give an intellectual reason for them.
Okay. In terms of say Madison pre-Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, you reference in the book a passage of a near riot that erupts in Philadelphia, happening simultaneous with the convention itself over merchants on market day refusing paper money. And those who are there, particularly say farmers, say people who are small shopkeepers, et cetera, this was really the only currency that they had to acquire basic goods and necessities, and they almost riot at this. And this is a moment for Madison, and reflecting upon what they're doing. You state that the impotence of majorities, the impotence of national majorities, owing to the structure of the Articles of Confederation, and specifically the minority veto it afforded 4 states to arrest action, the need to amend the Articles requiring unanimous state action, so one state could block action, which did happen. So what are the outcomes? I mean, we just mentioned one. What are the outcomes in this period that Madison found the most dangerous and that he wanted to remedy? And why are national majorities his goal and not, say, protecting minority rights, which had been run over in the states in many cases?
Right. So those are, I think, not entirely separate issues for him. It's significant, by the way, that in the case of this riot, while Madison is clearly opposed to paper money, in the passage that you cited, his sympathies clearly lie with these people who are having difficulties with it. It seems to me that the fundamental impetus for the constitutional project is, as you say, the impotence of national majorities and the inability to take care of the most basic functions of statecraft. I think that far and away is what concerns him most. And significantly, the violations of liberal values are cases frequently in which states are trespassing on one another. And so that he thinks, to answer your second question, there are a couple reasons that I think he thinks national majorities are so important. One is on the basis of the reasoning of Federalist 10. He thinks that national majorities are likely to be more reasonable. Right, that's almost inherently the case. But the second is that these violations of property rights in the states and whatnot violate the national interest. Right, they're sowing dissension between the states. There are frequently economic disputes, not only between the states as corporate bodies, but between individuals in different states. So I think the impotence of national majorities and the violations of individual rights in the states are very much tied up with one another.
Let me ask you, a big part of your analysis is this temporal republicanism, which we've talked about, and you cite this as a comprehensive framework to understand Madison, both his political thought and his public life and the judgments he makes there. And so we can talk about the Virginia Plan in this regard. We can talk about his opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the National Bank, both his opposition to and later his support for the National Bank. And of course, the interesting thing, as part of your argument, is there are all these debates within Madisonian scholarship as between, is he consistent? Is he a consistent thinker? Is he loyal to principles? Or is he overly pragmatic? Does he have principles? Is he just kind of oscillating which way? How does your framework help us to better understand Madison and better understand his commitment to the constitutional framework?
Yeah, so I don't want to say it's the key to unlocking all of his thought, but I do think it explains one point of consistent emphasis in his thought, which is this importance of delay and of in order to ensure that majorities are behaving reasonably. One way in which it helps us to tie his thought together is that there's no question that Madison's thought fluctuates. Right, in response to changing events, as I say in the book, he's born a subject of George II and dies a citizen of Andrew Jackson's republic. Right, it would be extraordinary, and it would not be altogether admirable if he never changed his mind over a period that encompasses that much change. But he is consistently concerned about where he sees passion prevailing over reason. This is so that, for example, in the early republic, in the pre-constitutional period, he clearly thinks the passion is occurring in the states, right? So that we need some centralized national authority in order to be able to counter that. But it's interesting that when he begins to shift toward the party system, he's identifying the passion as taking place in Washington within the regime, right? He thinks that Adams is very much motivated by passion and so on and so forth. So I think it's not merely the question of time, but this dichotomy between reason and passion that he consistently adheres to. That is not to say that he is altogether consistent in his thought. And I would say, in response to this sort of obsession in the Madison literature as to his consistency, that accommodation to practical political life is itself a principled commitment. And it's in a sense it's an almost Burkean commitment. So I would discourage, although it's very common in the literature, people from thinking in terms of was he principled or was he pragmatic, because the ability to adapt principles to pragmatic political life is itself, I think, a principled commitment.
No, I think that's a good point. I want to ask you, so if we think about Madison's belief in majorities and his desire to, his thinking that the Constitution has allowed auxiliary precautions, a term he uses, valves, various escape hatches, ways to ensure that the majority rules within the bounds of reason. So let's ask you, and we don't even need to go into the 20th century, how does this hold up in the 19th century as he exits from the public life, and also as really the entire founding generation leaves the public arena? And so I'm thinking of the type of populism. You mentioned Andrew Jackson. He dies under Jackson. So the populism that gives rise to his administration, the rise of John Calhoun, the atomistic understanding of state sovereignty, and also this inability of majority and minority interests to really compromise prior to the Civil War, which spills out into a lot of debates over, how we're going to add future states. Are they going to be free states or slave states? Does Madison's constitutional vision fail?
I think that's a very fair question. He clearly is growing very, very concerned at the end of his life about a couple of things. One is, perhaps the most important, is nullification, and the idea of this reassertion based on a misuse of Madison's earlier writings of state sovereignty over national sovereignty. But it's interesting that shortly before he dies, and I cite this, I think, in the conclusion of the book, he recognizes that already technology is making the country smaller. And he says that railroads are allowing more intercourse between different states and that kind of thing. He means that in an admiring way in the passage in which he writes about it. But in Madisonian terms, it's also clear that a contraction of territorial limits is not altogether welcome. Right? So I think the technological innovations that so undermine temporal republicanism today, I think, are already becoming evident to him at at that stage.
Now, and I was going to ask you that with regard to Federalist number 10. So what does this, collapsing of the country through technology, through communication, do for this aspect of delay that you present?
I think it's a real problem. I think it's a real problem because one of Madison's assumptions is that, and I think this is one of the contributions I attempt to make in the book, is that delay in and of itself serves to diffuse the passions. It's not a question of deliberation, or I should say not merely a question of deliberation that occurs between sort of opportunity and impulse. It's delay itself that he thinks diffuses the passions, and delay is something we simply don't have anymore.
No, and I want to return to the content of your book, but I do, so just a contemporary question follow up to that. So if we think about the Patriot Act, we think about Sarbanes-Oxley, we think about Dodd-Frank. Even to some extent, but maybe less so with the Affordable Care Act, there really was this rush to pass something in light of a public outcry that produced legislation that I think even supporters of acknowledge is vastly imperfect. And all of those pieces of legislation that I mentioned, and it does seem, and of course now, many developments have happened, the administrative state being one, and how Congress, how does it interact with the administrative state? But it does seem that this sort of delay is almost gone in certain respects.
I would say not only is it gone, it's been turned into a vice. Right? The ability of, particularly of presidents, to act quickly, right, to achieve change quickly, has become the measure of presidential greatness. Right? I say in the book that the new formula is that success equals change divided by time. So that the more change you can affect over a quicker period of time, the more successful that you are. And I think the clearest sign of this is the application of this 100 days standard, the first 100 days to every presidential term, including, by the way, the second terms of presidents who are reelected because people don't want things changed.
Yes. No. I mean, this is an important point. This is it seems to me a progressive intervention, particularly with the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, that somehow the president, apart from the House, embodies the people and locates their force and passion and affects it for change. And if he fails, then he fails as a president, as opposed to, say, Madison's vision, which you note sees the executive more as an auxiliary precaution to an overheated populace. And this is really an inversion of our regime that people don't even seem to recognize or understand the dangers of.
I think that's absolutely right. And this concentration of authority in the hands of one person is not given to deliberation. It's not conducive to it. It's not conducive to delay. It's not conducive to thinking things through, and it very much is conducive to abuse.
Let me ask you a question about the Senate and this application of temporal republicanism. And I should say Madison's conviction of majority rule. So Madison in the Philadelphia Convention opposes the compromise that would locate representation in the Senate by state, as opposed to proportional representation, which he favored. I wanted to ask you, do you think his theoretical commitment here to majority rule actually gets in the way of history and habit and practice that had developed in the colonies, and how people understood themselves as members of states, and they were now beginning to understand themselves as joined to a whole, but they still understood themselves through a local political attachment. Does Madison's, does his say ideological commitment, maybe that's unfair, get in the way of prudence?
I think that's a fair question if I'm understanding it correctly. I think the important point to keep in mind is that what he wants when he says he wants a nationally elected Senate or a Senate based on population is a national government that acts on national issues. Right, so that in Madison's mind, the vast array of governing issues that forge these identities that people have with their states will remain at the state level. So I don't think he wants to traduce that in any way. I think what he's thinking of in terms of is there are certain decisions that have to be made at the national level, or that ought to be made at the national level, and the question is, how at the national level do you do that? And what he fears most is a retention of this system that is essentially the Articles of Confederation, where essentially what we have is a league of states, each with an equal vote, that proved to be disastrous from a governing point of view.
How should we understand, and we've been talking about passion, reason, and will, where does the Senate fit into those relationships?
Yeah, I think the Senate Sure. I think the Senate is very much the linchpin of the system for Madison. It's sort of the flywheel that keeps it in balance. I think the key here, and it's interesting that he devotes so much time in the Federalist to the length of senatorial terms. The key here is both the 6-year term and the rotating election in the Senate, where 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years, so that there's no single point at which you have an opportunity for sudden change. And I think the length of the senatorial terms becomes very very important. And I think in some ways, although there is, I think, some very justified concern about how the Senate has been operating in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, I think in many ways the Senate is the one institution that most functions as it was intended to.
That's an interesting question. Would you say that's because of this representation of equality state by state, or?
I think, I'm drawing on my experience having worked there now more than anything theoretical, but what's extraordinary to me about the Senate is the persistence of institutional culture. And I think there's a very deeply rooted culture that senators, I think less so now, but used to be very attached to about the role of the institution. And in a sense, it's a bit of an un-Madisonian point, which is to say, what I'm suggesting is that much of the reason that the Senate has served its purpose is because of a virtue, right, rather than interest, which is what he's more likely to rely on. But I think institutional culture plays an enormously important role in the Senate.
It's interesting because I was reading your book. I was thinking of the filibuster or rules in the Senate for even getting debate started. Which are supermajority devices, it seems to me, and thinking about the commitment to majority rule, and yet so much of the practice of the Senate necessitates against that. Of course, its design itself, but I thought about that and what that might mean. The filibuster itself, it seems to, which has been a practice in our country's history, raises a lot of questions for me. I think for anyone who really looks at it as to how can majorities govern when it's not just you don't just need 51, you need 60 to actually move things through.
Yeah, and it's become that you now need 60 to do to name a post office practically. The filibuster is a difficult issue. There's no question in my mind that Madison would have real problems with it as it's practiced today, and the reason is that the filibuster has been severed from the concept of debate. It used to be that the purpose of the filibuster was actually to extend debate. You had to stay on the floor in order to maintain the floor and to continue deliberation. It now, because senators don't actually have to be there to participate in a filibuster, it's simply been converted into what, as you say, a supermajority mechanism. And that I think Madison would have real problems with.
That's a fair point. But I want to ask you, you have a great chapter, Time and the 10th Federalist. No small amount of ink has been spilled on Federalist number 10. You argue that it isn't about protecting minorities from substantive outcomes so much. It's about ensuring against arbitrary rule by majorities. And an arbitrary rule is something like rule without predictable standards and rule apart from the rule of law. What are predictable standards, and what is the rule of law for Madison? And also, let me ask you a third question: the use of these terms, important terms, justice and injustice. What does Madison mean by that in Federalist 10, and also I guess the companion piece, Federalist 51?
I think one of the criticisms I've heard of the book, and I think it's a fair one, is this concept of justice as being a procedural concept for him, but I think it really primarily is, so that justice is not associated with a substantive outcome in the sense that if your property is taken away or somehow regulated or whatever else, to Madison's mind, that's not unjust. If it's done arbitrarily, without foreknowledge, without some standards that you can adhere to, that for Madison becomes unjust. But what I think is very important to understand about Madison's thought here is that rights are never absolute for him. Right? Conscience is one exception, and that's a fairly narrow one, as I discussed in a different chapter. All rights have boundaries. The question, and I think, virtually anyone who looks at very closely at rights would have to agree that there are boundaries to everything. The question is how you regulate them and where you regulate them. And what Madison wants done is for them to be regulated in a predictable standard in accordance with known rules. So that, for example, I can't build a skyscraper next to my home, or my neighbor can't build a skyscraper next to my home. Right? That's because we have rules in place that prevent that. If we didn't have rules in place and the city somehow merely decided that my neighbor's home was going to be confiscated or he was going to be prevented from using it in some straightforward way, that for Madison becomes unjust. But not, and I think this is a crucial point, not because of the outcome, but because of the way that the decision was made.
It's interesting to think, along these lines of the Commerce Clause and the commitment to a interstate continental market of trade, according to the size of the country at the time, and this notion of the factions within the states who frequently, want to erect barriers to commerce itself and prevent, say, this flow between states. And I keep wondering, or thinking about your argument here. So would Madison, would he have allowed, or how would these factions have been negotiated if you have this kind of supervening standard of interstate commerce? Is it the case that it's inevitable that we develop something like a dormant commerce clause, which really arrests these factions majorities, at least in the 19th century, from the beginning, and yet now we've allowed them, particularly post New Deal jurisprudence, to develop untrammeled almost. We have this pathetic rational basis review, so we have a lot of inhibition of commerce going on. But you're kind of suggesting this is open for discussion in a way. There's just got to be predictable standards.
I think that's right. He at one point suggests that he's referring to property that's held by religious establishments, by religious corporations. But at one point he suggests that property can be regulated simply to prevent excessive accumulation of it. I mean, he says that fairly clearly. So I think the important point for Madison is that these are matters of public deliberation, not of judicial fiat. Right. So I think that there's no question that Madison would be quite surprised at what we've done with the Commerce Clause. Yet at the same time, I call this the Madisonian dilemma. I think in a sense the parameters of his political thought leave him unable to criticize it. Right, because it's been the transformation that we've worked in the Commerce Clause has been achieved in sort of a Madisonian way, right, through sustained consensus and that kind of thing.
No, that's a fair point. Thinking about some of your arguments here on this score, we just kind of touched upon public deliberation about rights. And I wanted to ask you, as you get into your last or your penultimate chapter, constitutional metabolism, you mentioned religion, which is obviously important in Madison's thought, and then also just rights and the Bill of Rights and judicial review and how Madison thought about that. And then you mentioned some, apart from the Bill of Rights, two decisions, McCulloch versus Maryland, and then also Cohen, which are important in the early history of our country, obviously, and remain extremely important. Let me ask you on religion. This is a big test for your argument, it seems. The memorial against remonstrance, the memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, of course, is directed against the push for public funds in Virginia for clergy. Patrick Henry, of course, a big mover there. And Madison carves out, by most people's readings, a role for individual conscience that cannot be invaded. And this is the problem with what Henry wants to do. And of course, this has wide support in Virginia. How does this writing, this important writing for religious liberty in our country, interact with your theory here that rights have boundaries and have to be negotiated?
Yeah, I think the important point here is that he carves out an exception for conscience, but it is an exception whose logic applies only to conscience, so that we sort of see more from the negative space than from what he actually says there. It's very much a Lockean argument that the state can have no rational interest in regulating conscience because it empirically simply can't do so. The sovereign can't reach issues like sincerity and the internal nature of the soul. But it's also there are a couple interesting things about it. One is that he addresses this argument to the legislature. It is understood that this is a decision for the community to make together. I think today, the first thing we would do if there was a proposal for a religious assessment is run to the courts and say that the very decision, the very proposal itself, is illegitimate, and that it would be illegitimate to allow a majority to make this decision. But the second interesting thing, as I said before, is that the logic that he applies to conscience applies only to conscience, so that this becomes the only right that for him is absolute.
And this is precisely this sort of almost ontological impossibility of the government being able to make a decision for the soul. And also you make the point. I mean, you know what Madison's that before I can come into civil society, I also have to acknowledge that I am subject to the governor of the universe. This is significant, which also is a very powerful point, often looked over by those say center left defenses of religious liberty, ignoring this important point that man has to make a decision as to who he is before God before he can come into civil society properly. That's a very powerful point. So this is interesting as well. And I was thinking, another criticism of memorial and remonstrance is that it likens it or reduces this to pure individual conscience and can't really make sense of the need for a corporate, say, autonomy of conscience. And this kind of largely leaves people as islands. And of course, what gradually happens is something like government growth more and more into things that are seen as religious. And government starts to assume more of these roles. Why? Because we can't make sense of ourselves in, say, a corporate sense as having a conscience. And this, maybe we see this now even with the way the government is moving against religion. We see maybe the full devolution of this. I don't know. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, he says. He says that one's duty to the Creator precedes one's duty to the society. But I think I think it is certainly a fair observation that it is an individualist understanding of conscience. The one thing that I would say that might mitigate that a bit is that he's not at all hostile to religious establishments, but to religions maintaining a corporate identity. So he says, in fact, in the Memorial and Remonstrance that it's bad for religion to be dependent on the government. So I don't think he necessarily sees the practice of religion as a purely individual enterprise. But I think it is. I think it's a fair observation that theoretically it's very much conducive to a highly individualized understanding.
Greg, let's talk about the Bill of Rights as we move through the Bill of Rights for Madison. You make the point he is committed to moving this through in the first Congress because of his commitment to majority rule. Namely, he had made a promise in the convention that this would get done. It was an important promise he needed to make politically to secure the affection and support of a sizable portion of people and their objections to the Constitution. His understanding of the Bill of Rights, though, would not be necessarily that it is needed necessarily for the protection of individual liberty. Why is that? How does he, flesh out for us this Madisonian understanding of the Bill of Rights, but also, and this is something you really do well, the relationship of the Bill of Rights to the judiciary, to the federal judiciary?
Sure. Let me take the last question first, because I think it helps to illuminate the other questions that you asked. He does not see the Bill of Rights as a tool for the judiciary. He sees it as a tool for guiding majority rule. And one of the reasons he's skeptical of it is this fundamental empirical point that underlies so much of his thought that majorities always get what they want. Right? Sooner or later, they're going to get what they want, regardless of what you may write down on parchment in an attempt to impede them. So the purpose that he thinks a Bill of Rights might serve, I think, is twofold. One is he seems to think it might serve some sort of delaying mechanism. Right. The second, and I think this is in a sense more important and more relevant to the contemporary dilemmas over the Bill of Rights, is that he seems to think it will provide a common language, right, and a common understanding of what rights are. The paucity, as you said, of rights talk today largely asserts from the fact that rights are matters of will. Right? They're not matters of reason giving. So for me to say you violated my rights is a way of saying I'm taking this discussion off the table, and I'm removing it from the political sphere. Yet there's no way to forge any agreement as to what rights are, because rights merely get asserted. I think what Madison thinks the Bill of Rights is going to do is give us a common vocabulary, so that if, for example, someone were to propose a religious assessment or a religious establishment, somebody could stand up and say, hey, remember, back in the beginning we agreed not to do that. But what seems very, very clear to me is that he does not see this as a tool for the courts to impede majority rule.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.